Hello, everyone. Welcome to our training today on trauma-informed lawyering. I'm Noah Joseph. I'm part of the pro bono team with Legal Aid of Western Michigan. Many of our clients are dealing with or have dealt with significant trauma in their lives, and this training is intended to provide a brief introduction on how better to represent those clients. I know many of you have taken cases pro bono with Legal Aid, so thank you for your service. For anyone else who might be interested in taking pro bono cases, please reach out to me after this training. And if I'm pausing, it's because I'm letting people in from the waiting room. For today's training, excuse me, Tom Cottrell will provide an introduction to trauma-informed lawyering with a focus on the science behind trauma. Then we will hear from Sue Keener, who will talk about how she uses trauma-informed lawyering in her practice. After that, we will have some time at the end for questions. So please put questions in the chat. I will moderate the chat, and most questions will be held until the end of the training. Also, today's training is being recorded, and after a little bit of time to get it edited, I will be able to share that with folks who have attended or registered for the event. Now I will introduce our two speakers. Tom Cottrell, LMSW, is the Chief Programming Officer at the YWCA West Central Michigan. With the YWCA for 38 years, Tom has served as a therapist to victims of sexual assault, child sexual abuse, and domestic violence. Has provided clinical supervision and now manages all YWCA programming for victims and families experiencing these forms of violence. In his current position, Tom manages the funding and program design of the YWCA's counseling services, domestic violence and sexual assault crisis response and advocacy, support groups, domestic violence, emergency shelter, supportive and permanent housing, and supervised visitation. He participates in a variety of local and state work groups and coalitions to keep salient within community decision-making the unique needs of survivors of violence. Tom is qualified as an expert witness in child sexual abuse in 25 counties in Michigan and provides both local and statewide training as part of his own consulting practice. Tom received his MSW from the University of Michigan in 1983 and is a licensed master social worker in Michigan. And then Sue Keener is an attorney and mediator in her own firm, Keener Law Offices, PLC. Sue has more than 37 years of experience since graduating cum laude from Indiana University School of Law, my alma mater. Go Hoosiers. Her practice focuses on collaborative divorce, mediation, and domestic relations litigation. Years ago, Sue was struck by her client's frustration with the inability of traditional divorce litigation to address the issues they deemed most important. She began to focus her efforts on healthier options for restructuring relationships in divorce. Collaborative process and mediation integrate her own values with her work as a lawyer, mediator, and trainer. Sue has served as president of the Grand Rapids Bar Association and past chair of its family law and ADR sections. Sue is a trainer in collaborative divorce sponsored by the Collaborative Practice Institute of Michigan. She is also a founding member of the Collaborative Divorce Professionals of West Michigan and a member of both the Collaborative Practice Institute of Michigan and the International Academy of Collaborative Professionals. She lectures regularly on family law issues and domestic mediation. She also is a great pro bono attorney with us, which she neglected to mention in her intro, but I had to add in there. Her office is in downtown Grand Rapids and can be reached at 616-726-5900. With that, I will turn it over to Tom to get started.
Okay. Thanks, Noah. Let me see if I can get my screen to share here. And it's okay. Are you seeing the presentation piece?
Yep, we're good to go.
And that's all you're seeing?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. What I want to start with, and Noah introduced this as me getting all sciencey about trauma, and as much as I really want to, we would be here for 3 days going through that. So I'm probably just going to crest the tip of the iceberg on that one, but I really do want to try to make this as practical as possible. So my expertise is in domestic and sexual violence, but when we're talking about trauma, we can really be talking about any kind of trauma. That includes historical trauma based on oppression, racism, or historical trauma based on child abuse. It all kind of can culminate in the kind of relationship that you may have with a client. So the purpose of your relationship, and this is really in many ways what I want to talk about is relationships, is that consumers will come in, or your clients will come in, and they're going to interact with you based on their history. That history certainly can be a domestic violence, or something that you know about, or maybe something you don't know about that is still reactive for them in how they view you. So today what I want to talk about is what trauma is, what it looks like, how it can manifest a little bit, and then kind of the considerations that you may want to take as you're looking at your practice and kind of reformat or rebuilding what you do. And a real quick example, when about 5 years ago, we remodeled big chunks of the YWCA. And one of the things we wanted to do was be as trauma informed as we possibly could be. And in order to do that, we had to take off our therapy hats and really view our environment as if we were survivors or victims of assault. So we tried to muster all our skills and experience and try to do that, but then we brought in survivors and basically said, what does this environment look like to you? What does this room look like to you? Are there things in here that cause you discomfort? And that really led us to, as we were rebuilding rebuilding the building, we made curved corners instead of sharp corners so people could anticipate what was in front of them. We changed the lighting, we changed the color scheme, we changed the furniture, all because there were elements of it that put clients on guard and made our relationship with them then a little bit more uncomfortable. So we tried to really be as empathic as we could with regard to how does a trauma victim see me? How does a trauma victim see our environment? And what can we do to mitigate those things? I can't go through and give you step by step how you do that in your building and how you do that in your office and how you do that in your relationships. But hopefully what I can do is give you some of the foundation that will help you extrapolate to your day-to-day practice. So that's my goal here, and I hope I get there. So what I'm going to be talking about probably sounds really social worky, and I don't really expect you to be social workers. Don't expect you to work in a way that's going to help resolve trauma for everyone. That's simply not going to happen. But I think you do want to be sensitive to what your clients are going through. You know, when we're working with folks with a disability, if someone came to your office and they were visually impaired, you would be making accommodations step by step to address that visual impairment. You would move chairs, you would hold open doors, you may be more verbal in your directions. Trauma victims aren't as visible in terms of the lens through which they view the world. That doesn't mean we still shouldn't try to accommodate them. So they do view the world through the lens of fear and panic and looking for danger. That really is the structure that they use. And a lot of things can trigger that fear. You know, and certainly one of the biggest things is whenever there's a power differential. And power differentials certainly exist in the court system. They work with when you're paying someone to do something, when someone has more authority. All of those things can trigger a trauma reaction on the part of the survivor, and then they begin to interact with you and your environment differently. So when you're working with someone, it basically kind of boils down to one of two things. You can be reinforcing the notion that this is a dangerous environment, or your relationship with them can provide a corrective experience because you do understand, you are more gentle, you are more predictable, and the differential in power is more greatly limited. And let's see. So this is a scary picture. No, I'm sorry, the next one's a scary picture. This is really just a definition of trauma for those, so you can have that foundation. And trauma is defined, trauma isn't a thing that happens outside of us. Trauma is how our brain works. And what traumatizes one individual may not traumatize another individual. We all bring a different set of life skills. We all bring a different perspective on things that happen to us. But when trauma occurs, it really is us experiencing what we would perceive as a life or death sort of incident, or something that at least causes us to think that life is not what we thought it was. And kind of the fancy word is disequilibration. It doesn't make our environment predictable anymore. And that can have some very meaningful effects on how we view the world, because when we are traumatized, our bodies change. When our brains perceive danger, how our brain works changes, and that can leave lifelong traces in how we process future information. So as I think I've already mentioned, a lot, my field is domestic and sexual violence, and those certainly can be traumatic events in that they change how someone's brain works. But lifelong experience of racism or oppression because of your gender identity, or combat experiences, or even medical concerns, or childhood abuse or poverty, all of them can leave trauma traces in individuals. And those traces could be 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and they could still have an impact on how someone is working with you today. So that's really important to keep in mind in terms of even thinking about folks' history as it plays on how they view the here and now. There's the scary picture. And this is the part we're not really going to get into, but if you ever want to get in the weeds about it, we can do that. Those are really fun medical discussions. But the point in showing all of this is to really communicate to you that trauma is actually organic, okay? It's not something we can talk our way out of. It's not something we can will our way out of. It's not something that you can impose logic on and have someone change their mind. These are biological responses to something that our brain perceives as scary and fearful and threatening. Those reactions are really inbred fight and flight responses that we share with all mammals. It's a really, trauma is rooted in some very primitive parts of our brain, which is why it is really not very amenable to talking our way out or thinking our way out. So I get this, really the whole point is trauma reactions oftentimes don't make sense in the context in which they're happening. A real quick example is, and I think we're probably all familiar, at least anecdotally, with, combat veterans having fear reactions when they're attending a fireworks display. Intellectually, they know there is no risk. Intellectually, they know they're not in danger. Physiologically, they react with fear and they react with terror, and they may even have flashbacks because those sounds, those sights, those smells are connecting on a very primitive level to aspects of their brain that say, you're in danger, you're in danger, you're in danger. Because once upon a time, those same things did lead them to be in danger. And the brain has that neural path, and that brain will continue to activate that neural path when something similar to what caused them those original fears is replicated in their life in the current circumstance. So here's kind of the Reader's Digest version, and I'm going to date myself because some people might not even know what Reader's Digest is. But it's the short synopsis of what trauma is. And so the bottom line is our brain acts to protect us. It wants to do is keep us alive, and it wants us to get away from things that are dangerous. If we were once upon a time in danger, the brain creates a path that says, when that thing happens again, or when something similar to that thing happens again, get away. And it floods our body with catecholamines, which is adrenaline, naturally occurring adrenaline, that amps us up, that gets us ready to flee, gets us ready to fight, causes a lot of tension. The catecholamines, like if you were ever in a near accident, like on the highway or something, if someone cut you off, that jittery feeling, that anxiety you feel, those are catecholamines. That's what your system is gearing up for fight or flight. That same thing can happen if someone is sitting in your office and your aftershave reminds them of their assailant. That smell connection gets that adrenaline flowing in their body. They don't know why, they can't understand why, but something's getting them aggravated. And what ends up happening then is they look to their circumstance to say, what's aggravating me? What's causing me this sense of fear? And they look at you and say, well, you must be a bad person because now I'm afraid. And that's how a historic abuse can impact your current relationship with an individual, because something in that environment was a trauma trigger for them. So it really, that in a lot of ways boils down to, it isn't real danger, it's perceived danger. It's how that crude element of the brain that once upon a time connected danger to something is now connecting danger to their current circumstance. It could be a sight, a smell, lighting circumstances, perception of power, perception of authority. All of those things can be triggers. The difficult part about, and I think it's in there, when we are in that fight or flight mode, when we are activated in that way, one of the things that happens is our prefrontal cortex, that's this part of the brain right here, disengages. Part of our fight or flight response is taking our thinking brain offline so we can react quickly and immediately to what that threat is. That's why you can't talk someone out or reason someone out of a trauma reaction, because the part of their brain that reasons isn't working at the moment. They are in self-protective mode and they can't think their way out of a circumstance because those parts of their brain aren't working very well at that moment. So here's maybe a simpler picture. We get bad things happening, you get scared, it goes into your brain, and basically one of two things happens. You can integrate that process saying, I understand what's going on, I know how to deal with it, I have certain feelings, those feelings make sense, and it's that thinking part of your brain that's working. That's one avenue. That's when bad things don't lead to trauma. The other side is when you go through that traumatic process that I just described. You get scared, your brain goes into fight or flight mode, it establishes lasting paths that say when these things happen, you should be afraid and you should try to protect yourself. One of the hallmarks of trauma really is, in a broad level, I would call it disempowerment. The person feels powerless. Most of us can endure some pretty awful things when we feel we have the competency to cope with them. People are traumatized when they don't have the competency to cope with what's happening to them because it's overwhelming, it's too powerful, and it's scary. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, my catchphrase whenever I do this is trauma has no clock. Once those neural paths get established, they are very, very difficult to undo, and they could still be active 10, 20, 30 years later. The other thing, and I'll throw this out real quick, it may or may not be relevant when you're working with clients, but trauma also affects memory. One of the things that it does is impact our capacity to create a linear memory, a full story. Traumatic memories or memories that are encoded around a traumatic event tend to be very scattered. So people disclosing abuse or people talking about a history of assault may not do it in a very comprehensive fashion because their brain has not organized it in a comprehensive fashion. So as they're talking about being an abuse victim, you may get different stories every time because their brain doesn't put all of those stories together in one place. Remember, the prefrontal cortex was disconnected during the traumatic event, so those memories are not encoded in a linear fashion. A lot of the expert witness testimony I do is exactly around that issue, that trauma memory is really hard to relate in a linear fashion that we can all understand effectively because the memories are not linked together very well. And I'm probably jumping around here a little bit. So again, I think I've probably covered a lot of this so far. The other piece I guess I wanted to briefly mention is this can all be captured under the kind of the title of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Oftentimes when folks think of PTSD, they think of it as these huge flashbacks, or people are hiding under the table because something happened, or they're seeing things that aren't in the room. And those things do happen. But a lot of PTSD is emotional and it's quiet, and it can be people shutting down, people getting anxious, people dissociating when they're in front of you, people avoiding things that are scary for them. in an automatic kind of way. So it may not be as evident as you kind of think from when you think about the full-blown PTSD that gets a lot of attention. They can be very subtle things at work as well. And I think I've covered everything else on the slide so far. I tend not to read my notes when I'm doing this. I just start rambling. So, and the other thing I'll mention real quick, complete aside, is that NOAA has a PDF version of this. So, and that's why these slides are a little bit wordy. It's on purpose. So once I'm done talking, if you want to reference back, you can have all of this wordiness in front of you. Real quick, again, just want to reference post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, what I already said is that it can be relatively subtle. Manifestations that we see in counseling and you would likely see in your interaction with clients, at least the subtler versions, can be things like avoiding safety planning. That is something we have. They don't show up for appointments. They respond defensively or aggressively when there's nothing hostile seemingly going on in the moment. They avoid taking risks, which could be showing up for court or talking to you for the first time or withholding information. They may even go back to dangerous environments. You know, folks who are in the midst of a divorce because of domestic violence returning to their assailant, or having conversations when they've been told not to do that, or doing something that looks like they're putting themselves in danger, or the danger wasn't all that important. Those are all artifacts of PTSD. Clients not following through with assignments that you may give them, gathering data or documents and those kinds of things. Often if they're dissociating in a conversation with you because something happened that was, you know, triggering a trauma response, again, prefrontal cortex disconnected. So they're not remembering the things you ask them to do. It doesn't become salient to them when they walk out of the office. The only thing that is probably going on in their head is, when can I leave? When can I leave? When can I leave? And they may be nodding their head and sound like they're paying attention. And the reality is all they're doing is going through the motions so as to get out of there as fast as they can. And that's even when you're having a helpful conversation with them. Changing demeanors dramatically when they enter new situations, like with the assailant or with their ex-partner or soon-to-be ex-partner, or when they walk into court or when they meet another person. There can be a triggering element to those events, and they may, you know, go into that fight or flight response and have a whole different presentation. Substance use can be an ongoing self-medicating component of trauma. We have folks who, you know, kind of focus on minutia and are preoccupied with little details. That often happens when people try to control the little things they can control because the bigger things feel out of their control. Part of PTSD can be self-isolation and withdrawal and withholding information. So those are just some of the manifestations that we run into routinely. There's probably a lot of other things that can happen as well. So oftentimes folks who are traumatized are just trying to adapt because there are these scripts that are running for them that they're trying to make sense out of, or maybe artifacts of historic abuse or neglect. You know, they may be hypervigilant and feel mistrustful because they always feel a lack of safety and they're always waiting for the next person to hurt them. They may feel guarded in defenses because that's how they've had to live their life. That includes people who are approaching to try to help them. They're anticipating how that's not going to be true and how you're going to betray them. They dismiss support because being supported by someone actually means you're vulnerable to them. You're giving over a part of your control to let someone support you. And that's sometimes a very difficult thing to do for trauma victims to accomplish. They may be overly reactive, dramatically reactive to small things. Again, that can be predicated on a trigger. So if in the midst of maybe working through a settlement conference or something, there's a request for a particular item and someone can appear to go off the rails just simply because you don't appreciate me, you don't understand, you don't know how valuable that thing is to me. And what it really meant somewhere in there was a trauma trigger that said, this is representative of how you hurt me in the past. And the reaction that they're feeling isn't just about that little item. The reaction they're feeling is about the abuse that they endured. And a lack of future orientation. A lot of folks who are in the midst of a trauma reaction, or trauma survivors in general, oftentimes have a difficulty planning for the future because they're so wrapped up in day-to-day survival. So if you're asking them about how they would want to live their life or how they want things to look like later on down the road, as you're kind of, you know, just determining how you want to represent them, those may be very difficult things for them to do. One, because they don't plan, but secondarily, if they're being triggered, that prefrontal cortex that we need to think and anticipate may not be fully engaged in that conversation that you're having with them. So when we talk about trauma-informed services, and I think I've already mentioned, we kind of borrow from that notion of cultural competency, that you want to be empowered to understand your client the best way that you can, and knowing that there are nuances to how they view the world. And our role is really to be as educated as we possibly can to understand how they view the world. One of them, and certainly an understanding, is based on trauma as a defining and organizing experience that really forms the nexus of how people view the world when they have been traumatized. It is a very, very narrow lens through which people view the world. And it's often based on, where am I losing power? Who's going to hurt me? I'm powerless in this circumstance. What do I need to be afraid of? How do I need to protect myself? And again, even when you're trying to be in a helping role, it's hard for people to believe that someone is out there to help them. And trauma can be rooted in a lot of things, as I already mentioned. Contemporary assaults that are happening, and sometimes those contemporary assaults may not have a lot to do with why you're meeting with them. For example, we've had, rape victims who are, for example, in the midst of a separation because of a divorce, were out in their own life, partying, went to a bar, and the regular scenario about rape evolves, someone is getting raped, but they're also in the midst of a divorce. It has nothing to do with that sexual assault, but that trauma from the sexual assault can impact then how they navigate that divorce and how they navigate that relationship with you. In your mind, those two things are completely disconnected. In their mind, they're one and the same. I hope that kind of made sense. And again, more historic life events, childhood abuse, war, poverty, all of those things can form a trauma mindset that have nothing to do with why that person is in front of you, but has everything to do with how they receive your help. And as I mentioned earlier, just powerless resulting from oppression and racism and sexism can also play a role in how folks are perceiving the help that you're trying to offer. So I probably said most of this already. The primary thing, and I guess it's that last narrative point that I really want to address, is those trauma reactions can go away when the client can experience you as different. That doesn't mean you tell them they're different. That doesn't mean you try to assure them with your words, but they really need to experience within that relationship with you that you're trying to understand them. You're trying to make sense out of their world. And you have demonstrated that oftentimes in physical ways. Again, I'll go back to that prefrontal cortex disconnect, which is how we process language. Oftentimes, survivors of trauma need to experience that support, not just hear it, through your words. So you are a part of a survivor's, whether you like it or not. How you interact with the consumer does have an impact on whether or not there will be trauma prompts in your relationship. Your behavior models safety, acceptance, boundaries, empowerment, and self-esteem. Again, modeling, not just saying. That will make the difference in many ways in terms of how successful your relationship with them is. So really those last two narrative points, that your capacity for compassion is the most valuable engagement tool you have. Folks who feel accepted, folks who believe they're cared about, are far less likely to be traumatized or re-traumatized or triggered in that relationship that you have with them. Now, this doesn't mean you have to be an expert on the neurobiology of trauma. It just means you have to be nice and you have to be understanding. And I make it sound like it's trite and simple. In some ways it is, and sometimes it's the most difficult thing you can do when you're working with clients who can be very frustrating in that regard. So part of that is having a partnership with your client, by sharing information, by sharing power, by making it feel like they have a place in this and they are valued in that experience. So part of what I think we really need to consider is, how do you set the framework for that kind of relationship to exist with your client? And these are real little things, and sometimes going unnoticed, or sometimes they're just assumptions, but even how you interact with consumers on this very basic level, like how do you greet them? How do you start conversations? How do you create safety in a room? For example, when I have a new client come into my room, normally when I'm doing therapy, obviously we're closing the doors and, we're trying to create a confidential session, but I'm not going to close the door until they say it's okay for me to close the door. I'm not going to choose where to sit. I'm going to let them tell me where to sit, where it's comfortable, or I will be checking it out with them. To give them authority and give them permission to re-empower them in these circumstances to say, I'm tuned into you and I'm going to demonstrate it in every single action that I go through to demonstrate that I'm trying to be sensitive. And that even gets down to, how do you manage symbols of power in your office? I mean, are you wearing a suit and tie and you look like an authority and you have a clipboard, or you're sitting behind a laptop? Can that be a trauma trigger? Yeah, potentially for some people who've been abused by people in power, who maybe have been abused by coaches, or, their partners may have positions of authority that have allowed them to be unaccountable for their assault. All of those things can be checked out. It's not that you don't wear appropriate clothing and don't wear a suit and tie, or don't wear a more professional outfit, but you talk through those kinds of things and you try to minimize the impact that they have wherever you can. And I'm hoping Susan will have a lot of examples of this when she talks about how to put it into practice on a day-to-day basis. These are things that we do as clinicians. I'm assuming some of the same, because we need to have a viable relationship with our clients. The same thing I'm sure is true for attorneys as well. So really just on this slide, we wanted to really focus that being trauma informed is not just, yes, I understand trauma, but it is a very deliberate process where you are very proactive about the things that you do. Because like it or not, we're going to have an impact on how our clients perceive us. And we either reinforce the danger that they perceive, or we act in ways that dispel that notion that they're at risk. And so it is a very purposeful thing, not just something I keep in my hip pocket if I have to pull it out. And quite frankly, it doesn't hurt to do it with everybody, because you never know what their trauma history may be. And it really is it takes longer, clearly. But I think ultimately it creates, a better business relationship with your client, and you can be much more productive with them in the long run. So that's me. I almost skipped my half hour too. That's contact information for me if you ever would want to talk. I love to talk this through with folks. If you have that opportunity, and particularly if you're working with a trauma survivor and you're frustrated with that experience, we can certainly do a little consultation on the phone. It's just something that I find is a diversion and really enjoy it. I think that's it for me, Noah. Let me get out of sharing. However I do that.
Well, while Tom is figuring that out, I'll start speaking. Thank you, Tom. I really appreciate everything that you had to share with us today. And so today my role will be to sort of tell you how I have chosen to implement some of these strategies that Tom has talked about here today, how I have worked to establish a more trauma-informed kind of a practice. And I'm going to be focusing a little bit first on how I do this as a lawyer, just in an overarching kind of role that I have, typically most often in my litigated cases, and my area of practice is family law. I pretty much exclusively limit my work to the family law area. And then I'll talk a little bit about how I implement this in my mediation practice, and also share some of the benefits of how I get more support from people like Tom when I do my collaborative divorce practice, which is probably one of the area of work that I do that I think most allows for support of trauma victims, and just really to help possibly bring about the best possible outcome for people with more attentiveness to the trauma that they may have experienced. So starting off as a lawyer, though, in how I interact with clients initially, early on, I do really make an effort from my initial contact and my office's first initial contact with people to consider that they may have some trauma. Whether it's trauma, whether it's just the stress of being in a divorce. I want to say to them, recognize that it's hard to call a lawyer. It's hard to be in a divorce process. And so my initial communications will talk about that. And I will also ask, my assistant to make sure that all of her communications are taking into account that these people are calling it probably one of the worst times in their lives. And often I'll say that they'll ask, how are you doing? I'll say, well, how are you? And then I'll immediately follow up with saying, when I ask that question, I know that people are probably having a difficult time. And I recognize, even if you're the person in the marriage that decides that divorce is the best option for you, I'll recognize that that's still a very difficult decision, even if they're the one that wants the divorce and the other person doesn't, that they probably have not come to that decision lightly. And so I recognize that, and I think clients appreciate that. I do know that I need to always stay in my lane, and I want to remind them that I am not a social worker. I'm not a mental health professional. And I encourage them to use counseling, engage a therapist while they're going through divorce. I really do spend time early on in my interaction with clients asking, what are they working with a therapist? Have they seen a counselor? Because those are important things for me to know. And I recommend that because I know that then I have sort of a partner in this process. I may never even speak to that partner, but I encourage my clients to talk with their therapist about certain things. And I know that that's a resource that they can draw on. So I want to clearly draw those boundaries for them. So one of the things I do, no matter what type of role I'm fulfilling, whether it's as the lawyer or a mediator, is I try to get clients to, if they're interested, I usually ask, though, I usually say, which would be more helpful for you as we get started? And often that's just an initial phone consult. I'll ask, which would be more helpful? Would you like me to start off by doing some talking about the process, or would you feel better telling me your story? Is there something that you really need me to hear early on that's going to help you move forward and listen to what I have to say? So I like to ask that. I like to give clients choices. I think that, thinking about people that might have experienced trauma or domestic violence, that they feel, like Tom said, out of control. And so if I can give them some choices early on and let them know that I'm interested in hearing about what's important to them and having them be a part of the decision-making process, I think that helps them begin to calm down. So I really like that. I don't just want to be a talking head and just be going through a rote conversation with them where I feel like I just have to check off boxes and tell them the things that are that I think they need to hear. So I like to get them to talk about their story. That's really important. I think that I hear that, and they know that I'm interested in hearing that. And the next thing I do is I typically, this may come up more often in an initial consult where I'm sitting down with them. I do, as Tom suggested, I do pay attention to the environment that I have in my office. My office it tends to have some really super bright lights, and I talk about how the lights bother me, so I have more subtle lighting in my office. But I want to know, are you able to read, and take notes? Is this enough light for you? Should we adjust this? I just tend to really ask my clients a lot about what's going to make them comfortable having this difficult conversation with me. And so then I, at some point, begin to talk a little bit about, just very generally, about these brain science kinds of issues. I I want clients to know that that they should not feel that they are that the fact that they've had a hard time concentrating, they may have bouts of crying, they may have bouts of indecisiveness. I want them to know that this kind of stress that they're under, whether it's just a divorce or whether it has some root in some trauma, that that these are human responses that are often out of their control, that it's just the way their brains function. So I'm really norming for them the fact that they may not feel like their normal selves, and just get them to think about that. I encourage them to talk to their therapist about that. But I begin to tell them that that's one way to encourage them to consider counseling, and not everyone, although I find more and more in today's world, people are more open to those things, that it's less of a challenge to encourage that. And I explain to them the importance of that. So I also tell them that I recognize that there'll be times when they might be stressed and they can't make quick decisions. So I always say to them, if I ask you questions, feel free later to add to what you've told me. I'm getting you starting to think about some things about your goals with this process, what's most important to you. But you may need some time to think about that. And you may be in an activated state where you can't really think about it. So I'm going to be asking you again, and expect too that you'll bring it up if it's a topic you want to return to. And I do talk a little bit about how I'm going to be the person who is more connected to their frontal cortex, and so I've got their backs. I'm there for them. That's my job, to be able to be a person who can still respond when there's those stressful things they're dealing with, whether it's being in court, whether it's meeting in mediation with their soon-to-be ex-spouse. I also like to give clients some tips about how to help with their interaction with their spouse in ways that that might bring back a sense of control. So people will tell me how it can be frustrating if they get emails or texts from their spouse and in the middle of their workday, or at strange times of the day, and how it just can send them out into the stressful state. And so I'll talk to them about maybe setting up like a special email folder that all the emails from their spouse will go into, or deciding that they turn off notifications and they're only going to look at text at certain times of the day. So, and I found that that's really appreciated by clients, and they begin to feel like, yes, they have control. Their spouse isn't going to be able to disrupt their day and to just sort of distract them from things they're trying to get done. So I'll talk about that. We'll have hope for the best outcome and for meeting their goals, but we're going to prepare for the worst. So I do try to talk about not just, lawyers have to talk about, well, a lot of what ifs, and a lot of these what ifs are negative, and here's what are we going to do if this happens, then what? And so I really do mix that in though with getting them to start thinking about their future. Things are going to feel pretty awful as you're going through a divorce, but you will, as time goes by, things will get better. I talk to them about, and I've been through a divorce myself, so I feel like that's informed my ability to prepare them for some things. I'll talk to them. I don't share a lot of personal information, but sometimes I do mention that I've been through a divorce myself, and I'll talk about the fact that at times it feels like you're 100% or 90% of your thoughts are around divorce, and it's hard. When is this always going to be this way? And I help them to see that, to observe, watch. You'll see that you may have thought about it, throughout your entire day, and then soon you'll reach a point where maybe you think about it for half the day, and then it's you're going to begin to notice that things change. And if they're telling me it's not, then I I'm probably going to be more concerned about, what is going on with them. Is there some trauma that they have not yet discussed with me? And I shared with Tom and Noah today that Tom's outline really helped remind me of this, where I have a current divorce client in litigation, and has reported that this is the husband I represent in this situation, that he's got a very cooperative relationship with his soon-to-be ex-spouse. They're still living together. They're co-parenting their children. They have a lot of things that are working well, but he tends to describe to me his fears in a way that it seems like he's in a fear of constant danger, and that just looking out for the worst. So I feel like I need to revisit with him. I'm going to do some return to asking some questions about maybe there being, anything that might be, triggering these things. And I think I've got a way that I'm going to do this. I don't always just go in and ask it point blank, but I think I need to be a little more attentive to finding out what's going on for him. He also recently started a new job, and I'm thinking, things like that, other stresses piled on top of the stress of the job. So those are some of the things that I think of come top of mind to my work as a lawyer in divorce cases. Turning to my role as a mediator, of course, the thing that I'm usually engaged in initially with clients who are going to be involved in mediating with me is starting off with my getting some introductory information, but then the domestic violence screening. And most of you probably are aware of the fact that divorce mediators have to follow a protocol. And I print that domestic violence protocol out, and I go through that. But I use that as a tool, not just for screening for domestic violence, but really understanding where my clients are coming from. What kinds of trauma have they experienced? What are their stresses? What are their goals? And I really think that tool can be expanded in a way that helps me really understand what's going on with these clients, and do a better job as a mediator for them. So I'm a big fan of that tool. I know some mediators complain about it and think it's a waste of time, but for me, it's the real foundation for learning about what's really important to clients and understanding this kind of history. And I need, as a mediator, they've already got a relationship often with their lawyer, although I do a lot of pre-filing mediation as well, where they may not even have engaged lawyers yet, but I'm working to build a rapport, to build trust with them. As a mediator, I do tend to dress a lot more casually. But I'm very aware of how I dress for my litigation clients as well. And I'll sometimes talk to them. If we're going to court, you might see me dress up a little bit more. I may look a little different to you, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I talk to my clients about how they should appear in court. I want them to know all the things that they should be concerned about, so they don't last minute get all these worries. Well, I don't know. How should I act? What do I expect? So I do prepare my clients for that. And so we talk a lot too about in mediation about that issue of whether we're going to all be meeting together or are we going to be caucusing. And that, I would say, whenever there's issues related to trauma, however I'm able to explore that, more often people, unless they're doing pre-filing mediation, they do tend to want to meet separately. And I think that is the best choice for them. After doing my initial mediation training, I came out of that. I did the Zena Zameta training. I think it was probably 20 years ago. And I used to think, well, gosh, this has to be the absolute best way to do it. They all need to be together. Everybody needs to talk. They need to see their spouse across the table. But that really isn't thinking about how much more stress it puts on someone who's had some kind of trauma in their past. So I've really changed my thinking over time. And I really listen to my clients, whether I'm their litigation attorney taking them to mediation, or whether I'm the mediator. It's really important for me to know. And I talked to them about the pros and cons of how we might use a joint session versus are we going to be staying separate the whole time. So those are some special aspects of my role as a mediator. And then I see that I'm getting close to the end of my time, and I do want to leave time for questions here, because I think we can all really benefit from hearing from you if you have some questions. And I know Noah and Tom and I said we're willing to stick around a little bit more too, even after the 1 o'clock hour, if people are interested. But I'll touch on my work as a collaborative divorce attorney, because this is where I found that I've been most able to fully utilize the world of mental health professionals. And it is really the most satisfying area of my work, because I do work with people like Tom that have this kind of experience of working with clients, and they give the attorneys feedback of how they see the clients, what they learn. And often they see very different things than we see from our clients when we meet with them as the collaborative attorneys. And so this is a process. Some of you, it's been around quite a while now in Michigan, so you're probably familiar with it, but it's really a holistic kind of team approach, bringing that support to clients who will know that they'll be getting supported by their lawyers as their advocates. It's a different kind of advocacy than traditional divorce litigation. But they've also got neutrals like the mental health professional who's there to support their emotional needs, get people unstuck when they get stuck in their negotiation process, and really provide the most supportive environment possible. I'll give a last example of one of my collaborative cases where this really came to be important. We were representing two individuals who had served in the Iraq War, and both were, impacted by their being involved in combat. And so we really structured everything to take into account making that environment as comfortable as possible for them. And we positioned them in a space in a conference room where both of them could see the door and know if somebody was going to walk in with a gun, which is what they were, they shared with us. They were very familiar with how their trauma experiences impacted them. And so it was, they said it really felt very supportive to them, the different supports that we put in place. So I will quit talking now, and I want to know if Noah will let us know if there's some questions. And
yeah, so there are no questions in the chat yet, before we open this up, and I think everybody can unmute themselves. So I think it's probably the easiest just to have people ask those questions. But before we do that, I just want to thank our presenters. Thank you, Tom and Sue. I think this was a great session. I definitely learned a lot from it. Thank you, everybody who joined us today. If anybody has any ideas for future trainings like this that you would like to see, please let me know. I'm happy to investigate that type of thing. We try to do a lot of things to support our pro bono attorneys. We're doing more and more trainings like this, putting more resources on our website and that type of thing. So just reach out to me if you have any questions about anything involving pro bono. And with that, I see that we have a hand raised. So Becky, if you want to go ahead with your question.
So I come from the corporate environment. I would love to hear a little bit more on how to put pro bono clients at ease, because I'm used to looking I'm used to how do I look powerful when I come into a room, because I'm in a corporate world. So how do I not look powerful? It's not intuitive to me.
Do you want me to take that, Tom, or do you want to take it?
Sure, go for it. I'll chime in.
Please chime in. Please chime in. I'll say, so we, in our lobby, we have a big screen TV, and we always have something on there like HGTV or a comedy show, something that's going to be calming. I mean, that and just the environment of our lobby is very calming. But I do always, when I'm going to meet a client for the first time, including my pro bono clients, I always go out to the lobby and introduce myself to them, and invite them to come back to my office, and just have a little bit of small talk with them. And so I feel like them meeting me and seeing that I'm going to be kind and approachable, and I think that can help them get more at ease. I will have probably talked to them most of the time. My pro bono clients, or whatever kind of client I have, I do usually speak to them on the phone first. So they've, I maybe reiterate something that they said to me that I remember from our conversation.
Yeah, I think if you're, it depends on what your environment looks like. I've been through some places that are pretty highfalutin when it comes to lobbies and offices and those kinds of things. And I know desks are status symbols and all that good stuff. But I think part of it is just being real transparent about that. I mean, if you're dressed, when I have to go to court and I'm dressed for court, I will tell people, sorry about the coat and tie, I had to go to court today. And just really be communicative about, this is where I'm coming from. And, and really, as Susan said, be as human as you possibly can. And sometimes that means apologizing for the ostentatious nature of your office.
What I was going to say.
Great. How about I was intrigued by some of the tips, like asking them where they want to sit, asking them if they want the door open or shut, what kind of little things like that, which I would not think of because there's almost like a protocol in a business meeting.
Mm-hmm. For me, I think a part of it is treat them like your neighbor. What kindnesses would you offer in a relationship of equality versus a relationship with a power dynamic? So, do you have coffee to offer? Do you have water to offer? Do you have a snack to offer? Hopefully you have multiple places in the office to sit. Our standard rule is you don't sit, the staff member doesn't sit down first, the client does. And then we pick whatever remaining chairs might be in place. And I think, Sue's idea about having something on the television that's just fluff would be great, because it really, in a lot of ways, demonstrates, hey, I'm just a human being too. And to try to take the trappings of power out of the scenario if at all possible.
Yeah, those are great ideas, Tom. I think about one of the things I often do is because I'm on the 10th floor of the Bridgewater building, people come in and they'll sometimes comment on the view. And I'll say, yeah, it's pretty amazing, and I really appreciate it. And then I'll sometimes comment, though, like, we get to see the traffic at the end of the day, and we feel like the attorneys in our office feel like we could do some kind of traffic report on the radio. And, I just try to maybe just make a joke like that, or maybe talk about the weather a little, something that is just the kind of conversation you would pick up with a neighbor or somebody you're standing in line with in the grocery store. It doesn't have to be all seriousness.
Great, thank you.
Elizabeth, looks like we have another hand raised. Go ahead with your question.
I'm wondering if you both could speak a little bit more about intergenerational or historical trauma and the ways in which sort of those institutional or systemic systems might impact the way in which we talk with clients.
Wow. I wish we had about 5 hours to do that. I think when we're talking about trauma predicated on institutional racism or other forms of oppression, if you are aware that, if you do have a client of color or a client who, may have identified as part of the LGBTQ community or something along those lines, I don't think it's inappropriate. We would do it in counseling early on in the relationship, just to acknowledge you've probably gone through a lot of shit in your life. This is not going to be easy, because it might prompt stuff. Just to acknowledge that things have gone on in your life, and I appreciate that make any power dynamics a challenge. And there will be power dynamics playing themselves out in court. So let's put that on the table and maybe talk about it. What's that going to feel like when judges are telling you what to do? What's that going to feel like when someone doesn't understand your orientation and judges you for that? It just basically communicate, I get it. And I get it in general terms. I want to know what it means to you because you're the most important thing to me right now.
Yeah, that I'll comment on another aspect that I've dealt with more recently because of the opening up of marriage being available to same-sex couples. I do, and I question it. Sometimes I want to have good boundaries with my clients, something healthy. You don't want that you're not looking to become best friends, but when I know that there is an LBGT relationship, I usually share, I have family members, and then I'll say, I have a child who's gay. And so that is something that I think I almost can physically see or even hear in their voice when they know that that's not going to be, they're not going to face their own lawyer not understanding some of the challenges that they faced. I see that just a whole change in their demeanor. And so that's the way I've decided to handle it. Sometimes they'll ask me just something more general, and I sort of gauge by how I see it's affecting them, how much I disclose to them. But I do try to do it in a more limited fashion. But I find that is helpful to when, especially when they raise the issue. But I like Tom's question, just you've probably been through some difficult stuff in your life, but recognizing you're gonna really be feeling that when you're going through this process, and it's gonna bring up other stuff for you. That's a great way to open that dialogue.
Yeah, I think a big piece of it is for us to be as predictable as possible to the clients we're working with. They shouldn't necessarily come in questioning if we're questioning them or if we're making judgments about them. So whatever strategy, and as Sue mentioned, you almost got to play it as it's happening to see how much do I reveal, how much do I share. But the thing that would prompt withholding or be a trigger prompt is when they're making assumptions about you because they don't have any information to go on. So the more you can talk about your own judgments, maybe your family, maybe at least acknowledge, hey, this is an issue on the table. And because I'm bringing it up, that at least means I acknowledge it. And I acknowledge that this might be a part of your history.
Great. We do have one question in the chat. How do you balance the ethical obligation of confidentiality with the client's need for an open door, et cetera, especially where you do not have full control over the environment?
The reality is I've probably offered that to hundreds of people and no one said keep the door open. It's the mere fact that you ask and you have the invitation. That's them experiencing you differently. And if I've never had anyone said, "Oh no, leave the door open." But they've appreciated the question. They've appreciated the option. We have some very small therapy offices here where actually the physical distance is a little awkward for some clients and therapists. And so we even ask leaving the door open makes it feel bigger, even though it isn't. When folks have hesitated to have the door closed, we can offer, would a bigger room feel more comfortable to you? Mm-hmm. So we can close the door for confidentiality. So if you have those options at your disposal, I think that's great. So the offer to keep it open is almost more theoretical than it is practical because no one wants to talk about their stuff with the door open. I mean, that's the reality. But I think acknowledging that it is difficult to sometimes be, particularly me as a male therapist, having a door closed with female clients is always something I need to check on.
Yeah, I found this issue came up more during COVID because I would typically talk with clients a little bit about, we'd meet with masks when we could meet after things opened up more. But I talked to them about the facilities in my office that we have large conference rooms available with a circulating fan and air filter. And so I would talk about that just by bringing it up, that there were options available to them, even if, I think that they really appreciate that. And I sometimes would say to people, I'd be in the office and sometimes days I might be the only attorney in the office and my assistant is up front and about 50 feet away. And so I usually talk to them, well, what would you prefer? Because if a person comes in for confidentiality, I would typically close the door. But if you prefer the door be open right now, we could do that to me. But then I would want to revisit that if somebody else comes into the office. But I agree with Tom. Sometimes just giving them the choice and discussing it is what makes it. They know they feel more comfortable. And I've never had an issue on that either.
And as a matter of fact, we've had the opposite in many ways where folks have commented when we do satisfaction surveys about the security that our offices have, that they know the doors close and they lock and no one can get in. There is that bubble of safety that they feel. Again, want to give them the option, but most are actually the opposite in the sense of we like the door closed and we like the notion that it locks and we like the notion that we're safe.
Yeah, that brings up another good issue I've done in some of my pro bono cases with some pretty severe domestic violence, or even my just private clients where there's been a real fear about, especially early on when a divorce has just been filed and there's some history of violence. What I'll usually do is we'll put a picture up of the spouse right near the front door by our assistant, and we take extra security. We may lock the outside door, and I talk through with clients what we're doing, even when they're not there. I just try to say these are the precautions that our office is taking because of the, what we understand to be your circumstances. And that does, I think, knowing that we're sensitive to that, and that we're going to be thinking about those things as we move forward. And I talk to them, especially those kinds of clients, I talk about the measures in the courthouse for safety, the screening, just all of those things. And I talk to them about, what they can do as far as being in the courtroom as opposed to waiting in the hallway, just different ways they can help themselves feel more comfortable.
Anyone else have any last questions before we call an end to this? I think we're good. Well, thank you both again very much. Thanks to all of you who stayed through till the end, a little past 1 here. Appreciate it. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. I sent out Tom's presentation already, and we are recording this, so we'll put a recording up. So just contact me if you'd like a copy of that. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.